but there are elements of all of people's jobs which have some susceptibility to automation. So the question broadly that we're interested in is what are the political and social economic effects of that going to be? And there's a whole suite of papers I can talk about. In this one, the angle that we're interested in considering is gendered responses to technological economic change. So I want to present to you some results around why there might be a gender gap in people's responses to economic change driven by AI. And then we really want to sort of baseline it or compare it to gender gaps in responses to other forms of economic change through automation. Through automation or through technological change. So in the paper, what we're really trying to do is do an empirical accounting. And we say that in sort of theory, there are four broad sets of explanations for why women may have different preferences on economic dislocation. There's a set of arguments about economic self-interest, that because of the structure of economies, women on average have different economic self-interest when it comes to exposure to different types of economic dislocation. So you can imagine that if genders are unevenly distributed within certain types of job classes, then you could have differences in how much people are opposed to different types of economic dislocation based on how it will affect them, conditional upon their gender. There's a really interesting / weird / slightly politically incorrect bit of literature around kind of what people call correct economic knowledge and how it affects people's preferences for things. Sort of this notion that the more you know about how free trade is supposed to work, or the more you know about neoclassical economics, the more you know about technology, the more you're supposed to like its negative effects at the individual level because they're good at the distributional level. We interrogate that a little bit here. There are gender differences, and I'm really obviously glossing over a lot of literature here on all 4 points, but there are gender differences in people's sociotropic consideration of others, how self-regarding they are, how other-regarding they are towards other people's social status and social station, with women expressing in surveys again and again and again more concern for other people. So if we find that there's a gender gap in how concerned women are about automated job loss versus men, it may in fact be attributable to the fact that women are more concerned about other people and their welfare on average compared to men. And then finally, there are really interesting questions about what the social status implications of widespread AI are going to be. And what we want to do is get a sense of where people's relative social status, which they position themselves and how they position themselves relative to other people, affects their responsiveness. So what we're really going to do, and I'll talk about the empirical strategy in a second, what we're going to do is see if there is a gender gap in people's attitudes in their responses to these different types of economic change. Preview, there is a gender gap across all three. Then we want to really just empirically try to account for what's happening. So how do we do it? We've got a survey we conducted in the spring of 2022. So just last year, it's actually in 10 countries. There's a fair amount of variation in those countries in terms of what their economic systems look like. They're all capitalist, obviously kind of free market societies, but there's different configurations of social welfare systems. You have different political systems in those places, and some variation in levels of development with Poland, for example, showing less degrees of economic wealth than Canada or certainly the United States and Australia. We've got sample quotas across it for those who are interested in talking about it. We undersample those aged over 65, so we've got more workers in our sample than we do non-workers, and we exclude some people for quality control reasons. But the end story is we've got about 18,000 respondents in this little survey. So here's what we do within this part of the survey. We expose people to one of 3 different treatments. And these treatments are meant to reflect different types of economic change that could lead to job losses. So if you just look at and they only see one, right? And they're randomly assigned to one of these 3. So you can see in the first one, they would read that American companies are responding to changing American consumer demand. I won't read them all to you, but by adapting their techniques and bringing new products to market, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And this could lead to, it could expand the overall size of the economy. That's the good. The cost of it is that it could lead some people to lose their jobs or face lower wages in the next 5 to 10 years as a result of those changes. Then you can see that we've got a bit of a preamble for automation and AI, and we've got a preamble for offshoring. So we're really just trying to describe 3 different sets of changes. Pepper.
So what is the context in which they're getting these? Is it a newspaper article? Or are they saying, we're giving you information and you believe it?
We're from the University of Toronto? Because that really matters, doesn't it?
Yeah, so it's It's a great question. So we do it in a very stripped down way. We're not embedding it in newspaper articles or anything. We're telling them that we're going to tell them about some things that could be happening in the economy, and then we just give them the information. And we can happy to talk about the trade-off of realism to obviousness of treatment in some sense, but I've got a strong preference for just describing to people changes that could happen and then asking them what the responses to those should be. So the basic wind-up here, right, is that we want people to think about different things that could be causing an expansion of the economy, but at the cost of some labor dislocation, and then understanding people's responses to it. So after we do that, what we do is we ask them if they think it's fair for American companies to make changes to adapt to shifts in consumer demand, for example. We're using a simple survey measure. And we also ask them after that to what extent they agree the government should intervene in response to these market changes or to automation, artificial intelligence or robots, or to offshoring. So at one point we've got a measure of their fairness about something, and then we've also got whether the government should intervene, in it. We've got a whole bunch of other controls that we're going to use, and we can talk about these. But what we want to do is try to just get a good empirical accounting of how our subjects are varying from one another. So one way we do it, for example, is we try to get a measure of their automation exposure using something called routine task intensity. So I ask you a series of questions about your job. I can get a job code classification from that, and then I can get a quote-unquote objective sense of how exposed you are to automation with currently demonstrable technology based on your job. So every job could be coded right into increasingly granular categories, and then McKinsey and all sorts of other people can tell you the likelihood of you losing your job. It's not a happy activity, but you can do it. We've got a set of other papers showing that subjective automation exposure matters as much and differently than objective automation exposure. So kind of a reality underneath all of this is that most people don't know how exposed they are to automation. So if you really want to get at what the political concerns them are going to be around this, arguably you should ask them how worried they are about it, irrespective of how actually objectively exposed they are. So one thing that we do is we also measure subjective automation exposure. We have several measures of their knowledge of automation. We have subjective measures. We've also got objective ones, which are highly correlated. Measure their concern for others, measure their ideology, and then use a social psychological measure to measure their social status, where we ask them to place themselves on a 0 to 100 self-placement scale, where 0 is kind of you're the worst in society, and 100 is that you're at the very pinnacle of it, and then we denominate that by where they would have placed their parents. David?
Did you ask this before the treatment or after?
This stuff all comes before the treatment.
Before the treatment.
Yes. Yeah. It's all pre-treatment. Yeah. We've got a big battery at the start of the survey, and then we've got experiments that are embedded after that.
And this is all you ask, or you ask a bunch of things, and this is.
There's more than this. Yeah. It's from a large survey that's got a whole. I can show you the whole survey, but it's got a number of measures in it. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. Questions are adjusted to countries. So
they're adjusted to countries. Yeah.
So for Poland, you say how much automation is there in Poland, for example, with the first question.
Yes. So for the first question, where we're estimating their routine task intensity.
No, for the previous, for the dependent variable.
Is it fair for Polish companies to
So is it fair for Polish companies?
Yes. Everything is homologated to the country in which we're asking it. Yeah. I'm a Canadian, by the way, so I'm not here as a total American centrist putting American companies in there. It's the example we use. Thanks for asking. And the estimation strategy here is very, very straightforward. We're going to just estimate people's levels of estimates of fairness of these 3 different outcomes, coded 0 to 1, use a very kind of simple set of controls, a very kind of vanilla OLS on this. And then after estimating these treatment effects, I'll come to that set of words in a second, we're going to see if we can close these gaps with the inclusion of more control variables. We've done other stuff since kind of doing decompositions. It doesn't make a huge difference in terms of the story here. An interesting matter of nomenclature, and perhaps you find interesting, is that we're estimating the effect of gender here, which is not really a treatment effect, right? In no way is this actually experimental. We're assigning people to one of 3 outcomes to look at, but then we're estimating the effect of gender on fairness. So we can talk about, it's straight ahead observational research. We should put treatment effects into parentheses. Okay, so this is a figure that's going to sort of tell them most of the story here. This is showing people's average perceptions of the fairness of companies making these changes. when it's described with automation, when it's described with demand changes, and when it's described with offshoring. There's actually a lot to tell out of this figure, but I'll just point out two things, right? One is that people generally regard companies making changes in response to automation and or demand changes as more fair than they do for offshoring, right? So the offshoring score is substantially less fair. It's on a 0 to 1 scale, so we're going to like something like a 0.35 on average between the two groups up to a 0.65. That's the first point. And the second is that there is a bit of a noticeable gap where female respondents are on average regarding all of these actions as less fair by these companies. I think we'll hopefully talk about it, Maya, but one thing that I'll point out to you here is that when we do this experiment, when we've done others, where we're measuring people's political responses or their beliefs about the fairness or the decency of offshoring versus job loss through automation, offshoring is always, where you're sending jobs to the country, is always regarded as less fair and less desirable. And just as an aside, American politics has been roiled, and a lot of other countries have been, for the last 20 years around the notion that America has shipped all of its jobs overseas, where a much larger share of job loss, especially in advanced manufacturing in the 1980s and 90s, was due to automation. But politically, there's a story about offshoring which sounds better. And you see it in citizens, that they're routinely more exercised by offshoring than they are by automation. Okay, and then what we're doing here is just showing you a set of estimates when we add in a whole bunch of our measures that we think might close the gap in evaluations between men and women. And the story here is really quite straightforward, that this gap really persists, and we're kind of cumulatively adding things here, and we get into the details of it, but the real story is that even once we throw everything into our model for which we have measures, so we've got all of our controls in there, the gap between men and women reduces from something like 0.8 to 0.5, right? Or 0.08 to 0.05. So it's just not enough to have all these measures to explain the gender gap. Something remains that we just can't close out. It's similar when we talk about government intervention. Here, this should be rightfully in the reverse, but what you're finding is that women are more supportive of government intervening in response to companies making these changes, in the case of automation, in the case of demand changes, and in the case of offshoring. And they're more supportive overall, as are men, to government intervention in cases of offshoring versus automation or demand changes. But you can see that they're actually least enthusiastic about government intervening in the case of automation. And again, we can put everything into the model and we can close the gaps a little bit, but we certainly can't wipe them out at all. So to just sum up, and then I'll look forward to your questions. We do find these consistent gender gaps in evaluations of the fairness of firms' responses to various market changes. They're consistent and essentially the same across those three. And the gap is that women evaluate workplace changes to be less fair, and government interventions to address them to be more desirable across all of them. And across all the theory that we identified, we just can't close those theory-driven indicators. I'll look forward to other questions about other stuff we're doing that kind of relates to this, but for now, I'll thank you very, very much for your attention and also for your patience in waiting. Thanks.
Okay, Peter, can you just come have a seat here? I hope all of you are preparing questions, but I'm going to kick us off by asking a little bit about what motivated you to start writing about gender and AI? I mean, was this something that you and your co-author started off by thinking you had a prior that there was this gender gap already? Or did this come out of other work that you're doing? So, I say especially, I'm looking at two students who are master's students, and I've taught them today in qualitative methods. And we talked about, we've talked about Bayesian updating and about what are your priors, right? And being clear about what your ideas are, or what your beliefs are when you go into a project. So just tell me a little bit about the motivation for the project.
Yeah, so this is going to be an advertisement for Stanford, as it turns out. But Maya and I were at the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Science at the same time in 2018. And Bart was there at the same time. He was a scholar of populism. And this latest AI wave's been happening for a while now, about 10 years. But at that point, Bart and I started having a lot of conversations about trying to sort of figure out what the likely political responses would be to automation, right? And just to fast forward a long way, I mean, looking back looking ahead 5 years, it's still hard to find a single political party that really articulates a good response to automation. Has found a way to make it sort of a politically salient thing, but we thought it would be. So we started sort of discussions then and started doing studies then, just purely observational. And then with a couple of who were really great postdocs at the time, now faculty members, decided to just sort of put together a much bigger project and ask about the suite of questions that we would be able to explore with this. And gender turns out to be kind of one of the ones that's at the top of the list because obviously it's very important economically, consistently big differences in attitudes around economic matters and political matters, right? And there's probably, on average, likely to be pretty big gender differences in the effects of automation when it comes. So the presumption was that if you're looking for something where you may find something, gender is probably one of those areas where we may find it.
Okay. So a second question is really about the title that's there. Why is there a gender gap in attitude towards AI? And what you showed us is that there is a gender gap in attitude towards AI. And what I want to ask you is, what do you think is going on?
Well, I don't know what I think is now the challenge. That it's very persistent, right? That obviously the things that we think theory suggests will explain this gender difference simply isn't there to explain it away. So it may just simply come down to basic political preferences, right? That men regard the actions of corporations as whatever they do as more fair than women do. We had a long conversation about that, but I don't know that I have an answer for it. But that's probably the most likely explanation. That there's just a basic political attitudinal difference in people's preferences for government intervention and their preferences for the behavior of firms. And that's not caught up by a simple left-right measure. It's probably something much more to do with kind of just orientations towards markets.
So before we go to the first question, you mentioned that there is a difference in gender exposure to automation. So you didn't talk about that when you presented, right?
Yeah.
You talked about attitudes.
Yeah.
So can you just say a little bit about that?
Yeah, so in sort of general terms, I think the really interesting challenge right now with automation is that if you were to look at, so the way that kind of firms think about this when they're, or labor economists think about it when they're trying to figure out people's exposure to automation, right? Is it one way of doing it is it will take all the tasks that you do over the course of your day, parcel out your day in terms of how much time you spend on those tasks, if you want to do it with some granularity, and then for each of those tasks, ask how replaceable it is by a currently demonstrable technology. Right, so I could ask you, do you do any navigation? Do you have to try to find your way around when you're doing your job, right? And how much are you talking to people? How much are you persuading them? There's all sorts of different ways of asking questions, and some of them are about the kind of types of things you do. Some of them are about particular tasks, but there's all different ways of doing that parceling. But then what you do from there is figure out what percentage of a person's job is automatable, and that's meant to give us an estimate. So when you hear things like, you'll hear things like 85% of respondents have at least one task that is replaceable with currently demonstrable technology, right? And that's going to go up. So that's kind of the general approach to doing it. The challenge for that is, you can imagine, is that it's not the case that we're going to flip a switch tomorrow and everything that you do in your job that is automatable is suddenly going to be automated. Right? Like, if you think about the way we write papers as academics, there's all sorts of that research process that we could automate, but we're not going to do it all at once.
Yeah.
Right? So the uncertainty in the political economic effects of AI comes at least partially and perhaps principally from uncertainty about which technologies are going to come online and get widely dispersed at what times, and then disrupt jobs. So if you then have a different sort of, on average, distribution of tasks in your jobs based on gender or conditional upon gender, then you'll have differential exposure to automation. Now, I see. Are women more exposed? It depends on what tasks get routinized, right? Okay. But if you think even at just sort of not a manual labor level, but kind of a waged labor level between the types of jobs that women are likely to have versus the types of jobs that men are likely to have. So I'll give you one example: being a cashier versus being a carpenter, right? Working in retail versus working in a kind of a manual labor. Some of those jobs are going to be more automatable. Now, it's really hard to automate a carpenter, actually, right? Yeah. It's not it's complicated work in that you're not doing the same thing over and over and over again in the exact same setting. If you're sitting at a computer or if you're sitting at a till, you are actually, right? So, and if those types of jobs are more concentrated among women, then there's more exposure to AI.
So it's sector specific. There's no takeaway that there is a clear differential, gender differential.
So it's sector differential, and it's actually job differential.
Great. First question back there. Yeah, hi.
So I'm not convinced that you've actually shown there's a gender gap in attitudes towards AI. I think what you have demonstrated is that there's a gender gap in terms of fairness and whether government intervention is necessary for disruption of jobs. If I am to be convinced that it's about AI, then what I would need to know is that the difference between the genders for automation, for AI, for offshoring is significantly different between these three differences. Does that make sense?
So what you would want to see is that the gender effect is that the delta between men and women within automation and AI is bigger than the difference for
significantly
bigger. Yeah. So if we were to say that the gender gap, fair enough. If we were to say that the gender gap was bigger in attitudes towards AI than it is towards other types of economic disruption, then we'd want to see that it's different, right? I mean, what comes out of this, in essence, I think, is, put it this way and see if you find this reconcilable, is that gender gap in attitudes towards AI is not appreciably different, I think, actually, in size or in character than the gender gap in views towards demand-induced changes or towards offshoring changes. It looks like the other ones.
Which leads me to my second question, which is, we know that generally in Western countries, women tend to be more socially liberal. Was that a factor that could have played in the response you got?
I mean, we measure kind of general ideological orientation, right? And you will have women being measurably more liberal on those measures. So when we put that in, it doesn't net out the differences. If we put it in conditional upon gender, it might, but I'd be skeptical that also is the explanation.
David.
I guess I'm wondering about the sort of the theoretical sort of guide here, sort of what you want to get at empirically. And I'm not sure what the starting point here is, that sort of women are different from men in what particular respect, whether there are a set of preferences that they have that directs this, whether there is a risk aversion is different for them, whether it is exposure, and the aversion side is the same, but the exposure side, I'm not sure whether occupational differences or exposure to automation or AI is something that is being, because of course there are gendered occupations that people select into, and if they do, then there is something about the results that may not be. So I'm not quite sure whether that's or whether the project is also essentially showing us that towards any kind of labor market risk, there is this difference in terms of both a perception of fairness and a perception of what governments should do to correct that fairness, and that in some ways there is a gender gap, but it has to do with these things. I'm not quite sure theoretically what it is.
Is there a chance you were a reviewer for the paper? Because your comments are essentially what I think reviewer 3 gave us on this paper.
Not to put you on the spot.
Not to put you on the spot. No, you don't have to admit it. No, but it's a very good question. I'll just put a couple things on the table. So there's a very interesting story that you're asking, or question you're asking there, I think, which is largely about how much of selection into employment now reflects underlying risk preferences, and may or may not be captured by actual things like routinized task intensity. I don't think it is, right? But if you go one step farther back, the differences in the gender differences in people's willingness to take on labor market risk are different, and they're unaccounted for in this. So we don't have it's the last paragraph of the paper. We talk about the fact that we don't have a very good generalized or employment-specific measure of people's willingness to take economic risks. If we did, How it would fit into the model is a really interesting question, and one in which I'm quite open to things, right? I mean, what I can, I'll give you a couple hints at it though. And one is that if we look at people's level of education and or their level of knowledge about technology, and we just model their subjective assessments of their risk of losing their job to a machine or a computer, what do you think the shape of the distribution is of the effect? It's essentially U-shaped. That people who are at lower levels of education estimate a high degree of risk for losing their job through robotization or automation, and people at a high level of education do as well, right? Mm-hmm. But those people at a higher level of education, though they think they're more likely to lose their jobs, are less worried about their material status because they think they'll just get another job, right? That my job could be replaced, but I'll get another one, right? Now, I don't know if they're right about that or not. They're probably overconfident, but it is the case that people's assessment of their job loss is not a one-to-one correlate with their concern about their ability to replace their income.
Why would you want to measure that subjectively, right? So I mean, subjectively, of course, to the extent that my subjective impression of that risk is not correlated with an objective reality, it's going to be completely correlated with all kinds of attitudinal things. I am the kind of person that thinks that I am exposed to this risk, even though objectively I'm not. Yeah. And of course, you may discover that I think things are very unfair. Yeah. And that also I want a lot of protection from the government. These things are attitudinally correlated. Yes. They're not causally correlated in any way.
Yes. So the question is, why would we be interested in subjective rather than objective measures? Yeah. Well, I mean, part of it goes back to the first question, which is, what are the political effects of automation likely to be, right? And I think if we want to start to do a first accounting of it, you want to have a sense of people's levels of worry, whether those levels are actually objectively rooted or not, right? And think about, I mean, just, you know, a very good part of the rhetoric of politics is actually politicians stoking fears about things that might happen in the future, right? And they're happy to do that with people, irrespective of how it actually grounds on their objectives. They want to say, you know, this could happen to you. I think it could happen to me, even if it's unlikely. Importantly, right? It really doesn't matter how you unpack people's their objective exposure to automation. You can never correlate it we can never correlate it with subjective evaluations that greater than like 0.5 or 0.6. So there's just there is a fair amount of kind of off dimension there that's off diagonal there that does a lot of work in models when you then look at how it affects vote choice, for example.
Let me move to a professor from the Oxford Internet Institute. Alf.
Thanks. So one quick straightforward one, which is there anything in it in terms of country differences? So the country difference that I have in mind is Sweden, which is an obvious place to compare, let's say, US or Canada, where, well, actually the US would be better because, you know, gender and exposure to, government intervention in the job market and so on is quite different, and also women's status. Yeah. But my bigger question, the second one, is, I mean, I would have to agree that you haven't shown gender gap in attitudes towards AI. I mean, I know that AI is a cool thing to have in your title, but you've shown gender gaps in attitudes towards automation, because, you know, your questions are all about it. Automation, in my view, would be that your job and my job are probably much more at risk of exposure to AI, even though you and I can probably get other jobs, whereas automation is an entirely different story. I mean, you know, AI, no matter how you define it, is learning to learn. And that's what you and I are in the business of. And, you know, we might outsource grading papers and writing.
Yes.
I should add that question is coming from my future CASBIS fellow.
Oh, very good. Very good. Good. Take study 41. It's the best study. I'd say two things about this. To your first question about country differences, there's not huge ones when we look at them at the top line, and all of our models will run fixed effects for countries, and it's not washing anything out. On your second question, it's a really interesting one to me, and I take it as a very, very fair comment. How we start to approach questions of AI and its effects for job loss within a survey is really it's kind of deceptively difficult, in the sense that I think we're almost sort of at the point where it's kind of silly to talk about AI as something, because it's almost a general purpose technology in some ways, right? Or it's a whole alternatively a whole suite of things. It doesn't mean anything to say that something is an AI. So when we're trying to explain to people how it is that job loss might come. It comes through a computer doing your job for you, right? Or some part of it being done. I think that's fairly described as automation. The engine to that might be AI. So I'm not debating the comment at all. It's a very helpful one, but it's hard from a kind of the level of nomenclature to think about how we talk about these things in a generalized way that is going to actually get people thinking about the same thing and not and to make it comprehensible to them in some sense, right? So we often bunch together automation and AI when we're describing it, but the workhorse questions are often questions which are just like, do you think your job will be replaced by a computer or a machine in the next 5 to 10 years? And we just leave things there without talking about the actual whatever the mechanism is at the core of it, right? In terms of actual replacement of tasks by things that are about automation versus things that are strictly about AI, where you've got actual, as you say, learning about learning, I think we're in trouble. Yeah, if you're a lawyer, or if you're an academic, or if you're a journalist, or a person who relies on the creation of language, it's probably going to get worse before it gets better.
Right here in the orange sweater.
Thank you very much. I have a question related to the way you chose to incorporate more economically oriented theory into the project, and related to your political left-right orientation control. So I was wondering whether there was any possibility to maybe incorporate something that goes beyond self-identification of the left-right scale, for instance, something like evaluation of government performance or evaluation of like more political economy related things, because I guess left-right means very different things in the countries you're observing, and whether maybe something like political attitudes formation could be maybe an interesting theoretical strand to draw upon.
Yeah. So there's really two things there you could do, I guess, right? One thing is, I don't think this is right, but one thing is a whole set of questions about people's orientations towards kind of economic policy or even social policy in response to economic things, and how much they support social supports generally for employment insurance or for other social provisions for healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. And then there is which we don't have. There is kind of measures of people's orientations towards markets and how fair they think markets are generally, right? It's not clear to me necessarily, right, that people who like markets as competition between people are necessarily going to view competition between people and machines in the same way, right? And this actually gets to this paper we have a second paper in this set that's about people's kind of views about the fairness of companies offshoring in a much kind of richer way, where we tell people about situations where companies have made economic changes either to offshore or to bring in automation, and we vary price to consumers as well as job loss, et cetera, et cetera. So we're trying to get at more multidimensional aspects of how people evaluate these things. And price does a huge part of it, which is missing from a lot of other trade-off studies. But if you get prices down, people think what's happening is okay. But even when you net all those things out, they just don't like offshoring. There's something about sending jobs to other countries that they find to be offensive, as opposed to redistributing them within your own country.
Question over here.
Hi, thank you. My question is really straightforward. Maybe I missed in the presentation, but how is fairness described in the study?
Thank you. So we ask people whether they think it's fair for I'll put the question wording up here if I can get the little clicker out here. There we go. That's on the clicker.
It may not be
okay.
up there.
Okay, so the question wording effectively is whether you think it's fair for firms to lay people off in response to these changes.
So it's the laying off part.
Yeah. It's because we sort of say these technologies or this demand changes or this offshoring can increase the size of the economy, right? It can make the companies bigger or wealthier, but it will lead to them to job loss over 5 to 10 years.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's a question maybe a bit building on this gentleman's point. I think it's maybe going beyond this study to sort of broader work that we might do in the same space. You're talking about this sort of residual of sort of remaining unexplainable gap for why attitudes are different. And I'm wondering whether it's obvious that is a gap, based on economic attitudes, or whether there might be just other factors at play that aren't economic considerations. So squeamishness about AI or something like that, just making it seem worse regardless of people's economic thoughts, or even if it is economic, maybe at a different level than loss or gain of jobs. So I've noticed among people in my office, like a huge range in people automating everything they can with AI versus people never wanting to use it at all and wanting to do everything themselves. There may just be differences in enthusiasm for engaging in a new way of working, regardless of whether it affects whether or not you have a job. And I wonder if that sort of might be an interesting thing to explore further.
So sort of like a general orientation and affinity towards technology.
Yeah, but just potentially an idea that, at least for some people, the shift to AI feels like an enormous change to how they perceive themselves and their place in the universe. And this just might be a bigger effect or a very large effect that's different to other forms of technology.
Do you think that's gendered?
It seems plausible that it could be. And I was interested in...
They're nice.
Huh?
They're nice.
Yeah, I mean, it needs to be to explain this, right?
Yeah, and that seems like an interesting question.
I agree.
Pepper.
So this is really interesting. We're finding the same thing in our studies of how people respond to corporations and corporate scandals. There's a kind of, we find that women react differently than men. And we wondered if it did have something to do with risk aversion, which we didn't have data for. So that's the kind of thing that we've been trying to find theory about. And I wonder if you've run across feminist theory on sort of character of risk aversion, as opposed to data, and what the theory might be. And basically, I'm asking you to solve my problem. But the so that's one sort of comment. A second sort of comment picks up something that Ralph said early on in the presentation when you asked in Poland about Polish companies. The threat of AI is that Google takes your job, and it is an American threat. Yes. And so it seems to me that that will be very core to the political economy of how people respond to it. So I kind of share the skepticism about the extent to which this is AI specific as opposed to automation. But I think when people think about the Google threat or the Microsoft threat, that threat wears an American flag. So I'm wondering, do you think that matters, or do you think automation covers this anyway? So that's well. First, I'd like just to hear more about what the nature of the gender differences is in response to corporate scandals. We can come back to that or talk about labor. That's interesting to me. On the offshoring one, it's there's something interesting which we've done, which is maybe you can tell me if it's interesting, but we've run experiments in which we've described a country. So you have a citizen in Canada, and you've described a firm in Canada sending jobs to Great Britain or whatever country it is, and ask people for their evaluations of that. And then in another treatment, you ask them to evaluate the fairness of an American company, or let's say an Irish company, sending jobs to Great Britain. Right? So leave aside the particular countries there for a second, but in one case you're asking about a company in your own country sending the jobs away, or a company in another country sending jobs away to the same third country. And people have starkly greater valuations of the unfairness of people sending jobs from their own country. So there is something about the national nature of the corporation that's doing it. Now, what you're talking about is the inverse of that in some sense, right? Which is, are people worried that this is about the Americanization of jobs and the Americanization takeover of jobs? I'm not sure that they are so much as just the general thing, but it's eminently testable, right? To run a set of scenarios or vignettes where you're asking about American companies taking these jobs versus these jobs being sent to America, or however you want to phrase it, versus other countries. I could, though, to extend it, imagine that for politicians or political entrepreneurs who are trying to make take some political advantage of the fear over this, priming American companies and talking about American companies doing it is probably a pretty good strategy. Whether people think about it before they've heard it, it's probably persuasive once they do hear it that what you have to be concerned about is not only losing your job, but losing it to an American country, an American company.
Okay, I'm gonna ask a question, and then I'll come to the other hands, and maybe we can just in the interest of time collect these questions, and you can answer what you can in the remaining time. So when I talk to our students about gender here, what they understand gender to be is different than what I understood gender to be at their age. And so that suggests that there's a cohort effect in understanding towards gender, right? So, and we know that what masculinity and femininity mean, right, which is caught up with ideas of gender, is changing. So I wondered if, as you are seeing, if you think that matters, and if you can test that by looking at, for example, how different generations, different cohorts are responding to that. Because if that's right, so as there is a kind of general more mixing of, or at least less dichotomous understandings of gender, then younger cohorts should be less, you should see less of this gap that you're describing. And I wondered if you can, so that's my question. And let me then turn to the study here.
So I am a government official. I work for the Department for Education. And so my question is kind of more about the policy response end of things. So if we take what we know to sort of assume that to be true, what would you and your team sort of expect that a good government policy response should be to this new information? How should questions about kind of what people are choosing at what point in their career, what women might be persuaded into or otherwise, how does the government kind of incorporate that into a really good quality policy response?
And then finally, David.
I'm just, again, sort of wondering about sort of the concept of fairness in terms of, and I suppose that there are two sides to fairness here, right? So there is a fairness side that has to do with the fairness of market income inequality in some way, sort of because you include that side in the questions about getting paid more or less. And I guess that I was thinking about sort of the work of Charlotte Cavalier in this idea that we think market income inequality is fair to the degree that there is this proportionality norm that you put an effort and you get it. And there is maybe something that is included in this that is reflected by that. But there is another side of fairness here which has to do with that do companies have a right to lower prices or to do something, right, that is having a market income inequality effect. And now there seems to be an inherent difference in fairness if you tell me this is being done because of demand reasons versus this is being done because you are offshoring. And now I'm going to respond differently. I think the interesting side of your findings, which is sort of undermined by the title, sort of the way that Maya was saying at the beginning, is that you're keeping that impression of fairness constant within each of these questions. And you're showing that the gap is there, but doesn't actually change from question to question. So that you have a level effect that is sort of connected to the fairness of offshoring versus demand, but you're showing that consistently women have a higher sort of conception of fairness. But that difference actually doesn't change when you change the fairness, which I think is really interesting. But it's not quite the way that sort of you frame the.
So yes. So let me take these in reverse order. So the question. So I'll say two things about this fairness question. I mean, one is that I think you're exactly right that you essentially have a fixed effect for gender that views these sort of job-losing actions as less fair, but there's something about offshoring in which I think people see agency and choice by corporations, whereas automation is probably a response to technological pressure and other competition, and certainly demand changes are, by definition, the way we describe them. So, and there's no difference in how people set different levels on those things, which I think is important. I shall do this in kind of the following. To your point, Maya, I think it's really interesting, obviously, thinking about gender in a constructed fashion, and there are different ways to do this in surveys. It's very hard for us to pick up gender identity in surveys. We've been doing work in the Canadian election study trying to figure out the optimal measures of gender and sex, and it's quite contested, actually, not because around issues of who should be recognized or not, but just in terms of how people self-identify and the sequence in which you have to ask it. But one way of getting at it, of course, is to use these kind of now well-developed batteries of gender expression. It's a very interesting question if we think that risk is at the core of some of this, to start to parcel out how much risk is itself gendered in terms of how you understand it, right? And what does one understand a man to be in terms of how much risk they're exposed to, right? So I don't have an answer to. I think it's an extremely interesting proposition that that those cohort effects are not only going to, are not only changing our self-conceptions of gender, or our social conceptions of gender, but also how people would view their place in an economy as a result of that. What the future will hold for them. To the question of what government should do, it's a hard question to answer for free, for sure, and easily. But what I would say is that I think that to the extent that governments try to engage in active kind of labor market training and preparation of people for labor markets, this is a really difficult time for it, because I'm sort of not convinced that, I'm not convinced of three things. One, that people know how exposed they're going to be to automation, right? The government's going to know who's going to be exposed and be able to target them. And the proposition that all that one needs is critical thinking and the ability to read and write well is, that's a more strained proposition than it's ever been, given the direction of generative AI. So I don't have any advice except to wish you luck.
Well, on that happy note, let me just draw this session to a close right on time. And please join me in thanking Peter for a really great talk.